Jackson had been traveling for hours, the weight of the long journey pressing down on him as the sleek spacecraft glided through the air. He was a human explorer, sent to a distant planet to assist in establishing peaceful relations with a race of aliens he had only read about. His mission was clear: learn about them, offer his help, and hope for a smooth process. But nothing could have prepared him for the grandeur of the alien world, for what lay ahead. As Jackson's boots hit the polished floors of the grand hall, he was immediately struck by the strange beauty of the place. The walls were a soft blend of deep blues and purples, shimmering like the night sky. There was a soft, almost hypnotic hum in the air, as if the palace itself was alive. Tall, transparent pillars stretched high above, supporting the ceiling that seemed to vanish into mist. Jackson's heart raced, not just from the surreal beauty of the palace, but because he knew he was about to meet someone important, the alien princess Selene. She was said to be the most beautiful being in the galaxy. It's a ruler in a making, and everyone from his superiors to the locals had spoken of her with deep reverence. They said her beauty was unlike anything any of them had ever seen. But Jackson had never been one to care much for appearances. He was here for the mission, not for some alien princess. The room was buzzing with alien dignitaries, all of them speaking in a language that Jackson could barely understand. He kept his eyes on the ground, trying to blend in. After all, he wasn't the center of attention, she was. As the doors to the throne room opened, everything went quiet. Jackson couldn't stop himself from looking up. There, standing in the center of the room, was Selene. The moment he saw her, his breath caught in his chest. She wasn't like anyone he had ever met. She stood tall and graceful, with skin that shimmered like silver moonlight. Her eyes, large and bright, seemed to hold centuries of wisdom, and yet there was a softness in them that made her seem approachable. Her long, dark hair flowed like silk, and the golden robes she wore seemed to catch the light in every direction. For a moment, Jackson stood frozen, mesmerized by her. She was everything the stories had said and more. It wasn't just her looks. It was the aura she carried with her, the sense of power and grace in the way she moved, in the way she commanded. The attention of the entire room without saying a word. He murmured under his breath, "The most beautiful thing I've ever seen." It was barely audible, more of a thought than a statement. Jackson had no intention of being heard, especially not by her. But the moment the words escaped his lips, something happened. The hum of the room seemed to stop. The air shifted. Slowly, almost as if in slow motion, Selene turned to face him. Jackson's eyes widened as their gazes locked. She didn't look surprised or amused. She looked calm, as if she had been expecting him all along. The room remained silent, as if everyone knew what was about to happen. Jackson felt his heart pound in his chest. It was an odd feeling, something between awe and discomfort. He had never been the type to let appearances or emotions cloud his judgment, but in this moment, he couldn't deny the pull he felt. There was something about her that made him forget the reason he was here, that made him forget everything except her. "You must be Jackson, the human explorer." Her voice was soft but carried the weight of authority. It wasn't loud, but it commanded attention, cutting through the silence like a blade. Jackson snapped out of his trance. He nodded quickly, trying to regain his composure. He was here on a mission, he reminded himself. Nothing more. "Yes, Your Highness." His voice was steady, though he could feel his hands beginning to sweat. "I've heard much about you." Selene's eyes sparkled slightly at his words, but she said nothing for a moment, studying him as though she were trying to gauge something deeper. Then, to his surprise, she smiled gently, but with a hint of mischief. "I am honored to meet you, Jackson. The galaxy speaks highly of your kind. I hope you will see that we are not so different." Jackson didn't know how to respond to that. What could he say? His people had always been cautious about making contact with new species, fearing the unknown. But Selene didn't look dangerous. She looked kind. And yet Jackson knew that looks could be deceiving. He had to be careful, before he could think of something to say. A servant stepped forward and handed Selene a scroll, bowing deeply. She took it. Her attention momentarily diverted. Jackson watched her closely, still trying to process what had just happened. What had he felt when he saw her? He wasn't sure, but it was unlike anything he had experienced before. Was it admiration? Or something else? The room slowly began to fill with murmurs as the tension eased. Jackson took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in his mind. The princess was already turning her attention back to the group of diplomats. But Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't fully let him go. He had to focus. He was here for a reason, but the princess, Celine. Her name echoed in his mind as if it were a song, a melody he couldn't forget. After the first meeting with Celine, Jackson couldn't help but feel different. He tried to push the feelings aside, but every time he thought about her, the memory of her calm gaze stayed with him. He knew he had to focus on his mission, but the pull between him and the alien princess was undeniable. The rest of the day passed in a blur as Jackson met with various diplomats, discussing plans for the future of their two species. But no matter how hard he tried, his mind always drifted back to Celine. As the evening approached, Jackson was invited to a private dinner with the princess. He was told it was a chance for him to learn more about her culture and the people she would one day lead. Jackson wasn't sure what to expect, but he couldn't pass up the opportunity. He walked into a large, beautifully decorated room. The long table was covered in delicate silverware, and the walls were adorned with vibrant tapestries that seemed to tell stories of battles, peace, and ancient traditions. The air was warm, and a soft melodic music played in the background. Celine was already sitting at the head of the table. She was wearing a different outfit, no more casual, but still elegant. Her long hair flowed down her back, and her eyes sparkled with the same intensity Jackson had seen earlier. She looked up as he entered, offering him a welcoming smile. "Please, sit down, Jackson." Her voice was soft but commanding, and Jackson could hear the kindness in her words. He sat across from her, trying to keep his composure. The dinner began with small talk, and Jackson learned more about her home planet Aurora. The people of Aurora were peaceful, proud of their heritage, and wise beyond measure. They had mastered technology that Jackson could only dream of, yet they were careful with how they used it, ensuring it never brought harm. Their culture revolved around balance, both with nature and with each other. "You must think we're very different from your people," Celine said, her eyes studying him as she took a bite of her food. Jackson looked down at his plate, feeling a little embarrassed. I don't know what to think yet. I've never met anyone like you before." Celine smiled. "Not many have." She paused for a moment, as if considering something. "But I think we're more alike than you realize." Jackson looked up at her, his brow furrowing slightly. He wasn't sure what she meant, but there was something in the way she said it that made him want to understand. "How do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. She paused, her gaze distant for a moment before returning to him. "We both want the same thing, peace." "But peace doesn't come easily, does it?" She gave him a soft, knowing look. Jackson hesitated before answering. He had spent his life fighting for peace, but he knew the challenges it brought.
"No."
"It never does." They sat in silence for a moment, the conversation shifting to more general topics. Yet, despite the calm, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Celine's words. Something deeper, something unspoken between them. As the night went on, he found himself drawn to her. It wasn't just her beauty or her kindness. It was the way she carried herself. It's the way she thought. The way she made him feel understood in a way no one else ever had. After dinner, they moved to a balcony overlooking the planet's breathtaking landscape. The sky was a deep violet, and distant stars twinkled like diamonds scattered across a dark canvas. Celine leaned on the railing, gazing out into the distance. Jackson stood next to her, his hands resting on the cold metal of the balcony. "It's beautiful here," Jackson murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." Selena's voice was soft, but there was a sadness behind it. "It is, but beauty doesn't always protect you from the harshness of the world." Jackson looked at her, sensing that there was something more she wasn't saying. "What do you mean?" She turned to face him, her expression serious now. I am meant to lead my people one day, Jackson. But leadership isn't just about making decisions. It's about sacrifice. It's about doing what's best for others, even when it's hard. Sometimes that means making choices no one else can understand. Jackson nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He could see the burden she carried, even though she tried to hide it behind her calm demeanor. "You've already made sacrifices, haven't you?" Jackson asked quietly. Celine didn't answer immediately. She looked out over the balcony again, her eyes distant. Everyone has their burdens, but some are heavier than others. She turned to him, her gaze intense. "I know what I must do to protect my people, but I fear that I may have to choose a path that will change everything. And I may lose more than I'm ready for." Jackson felt a pang of sympathy for her, but he couldn't deny the connection between them, the unspoken bond that had been growing ever since their first meeting. Something was shifting inside him, a feeling he couldn't explain but knew was real. He took a deep breath. "I'll help you, Celine, whatever it takes." She looked at him, her eyes softening. "You don't even know what you're offering." Jackson smiled slightly. "Maybe, but I know this. I don't want to see you fight this alone." For a moment, Celine said nothing, but her gaze softened, and she nodded slightly. "Thank you, Jackson." As the night stretched on, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of warmth settle in his chest. There was something undeniable between them. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he felt certain of one thing: he would do whatever it took to stand by her side. The stars shone brightly above, and Jackson realized that the path ahead, though uncertain, was one he was willing to walk. The days following Jackson's private dinner with Princess Celine were filled with a quiet kind of tension. He couldn't deny that he was still drawn to her, his thoughts constantly returning to their conversations and the unspoken connection they shared. But the weight of his mission was never far from his mind. He had come here for a reason, after all, not to get tangled in feelings he didn't understand. Celine, on the other hand, seemed to balance her duty and her personal feelings with remarkable poise. It was something Jackson admired, though it made him wonder what burden she carried behind her calm exterior. Her duty as a future leader was evident in everything she did, from the way she spoke to the way she moved through her palace. Yet there was always a hint of something more, something deeper in her eyes. One morning, Jackson was summoned to the palace once again. This time, the atmosphere was more formal. He was led to a large room where Celine awaited him, seated at a long table covered in maps and documents. She looked up as he entered, giving him a small nod of acknowledgement. "Jackson, thank you for coming." Her voice was as calm as ever, but there was something urgent in her tone. "I need to speak with you about something important." Jackson nodded, his curiosity piqued. "Of course, Your Highness. What's on your mind?" Celine motioned for him to sit across from her. "It's about the future of my people. I'm being asked to make a decision, one that could change everything." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the map in front of her. "Our enemies are growing stronger, and if we don't act soon, we may lose everything we've worked for." Jackson leaned forward, sensing the weight of her words. He had heard about the rival species threatening Aurora's peaceful existence, but hearing it from her made it real, more personal. "What do you want me to do?" "Need you to understand what's at stake, Jackson. The choices I make won't be easy, and they won't always be popular." She sighed, her gaze distant. "Sometimes a leader has to make decisions that will upset the very people they care about." Jackson studied her, watching as she spoke with such confidence, yet with a hint of sadness. It was clear that she didn't take her role lightly. He admired that about her. But what struck him the most was how she saw him as someone capable of understanding the weight of her responsibilities. There was a level of trust in her eyes that he didn't take for granted. "I don't pretend to understand everything about your people or your world, Celine," Jackson said softly, "but I know one thing for sure. You're a leader, and you care deeply about your people. Whatever decision you make, I'm sure it's the right one." Her eyes softened at his words, but she didn't smile. Instead, she simply nodded, as if weighing his words carefully. "Kind Jackson, I wish it were that simple." The conversation shifted then, as they began to discuss the situation at hand. Selene explained the tensions between her people and the rival species, the Zyrexians, who had long been a threat to the peace of Aurora. The Zyrexians were a ruthless people, with advanced weaponry and an aggressive military strategy. Aurora had always maintained peace, relying on diplomacy rather than conflict. But now, Selene knew that diplomacy alone wouldn't be enough. "I don't want war," she said, her voice firm. "But I fear it's the only option left." Jackson felt the weight of her words. War was never easy, but sometimes it was inevitable. He understood that. But what he didn't understand was how Selene could be so sure of herself, even as she faced such uncertainty. "Is there any way to avoid this?" Jackson asked, his voice quiet. Selene looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know." She paused, a hint of vulnerability slipping through. "But I will do whatever it takes to protect my people, even if it means making choices I never thought I would have to make." Jackson could see the conflict in her eyes. She wasn't just talking about politics or strategy. She was talking about her own heart, her own desires, and the sacrifices she would have to make. The weight of leadership was heavy, and he could feel it in the air between them. "What will you do?" Jackson asked, his voice low. Selene looked down at the map in front of her, her fingers tracing the lines of her world. "I don't know yet." She met his eyes again. "But I do know that I can't do this alone. I need help, Jackson." Jackson didn't hesitate. "I'll help you, whatever it takes." She studied him for a long moment, and for the first time, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Thank you." Her voice was softer now, and there was a warmth to it that Jackson hadn't heard before. They spent the next few hours discussing strategy and potential allies, Jackson offering his thoughts on the best course of action. But through it all, there was a quiet understanding between them. Neither of them knew what the future held, but they both knew that the choices ahead would shape not just Aurora's fate, but their own as well. As the meeting came to an end, Selene stood, her posture straight and regal. "I must prepare for what's to come, Jackson. Thank you for being here with me." Jackson stood as well, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm not going anywhere, Selene." She gave him a nod, her expression serious once again. "I know. And for that, I'm grateful." As Jackson left the room, he couldn't help but feel a sense of determination rise within him. He had come here to help, and now he understood more than ever that his role in this conflict was more than just an outsider. He was a part of something bigger, something important. And no matter where the journey took him, he would stand by Selena's side, ready to face whatever came next. The days after Jackson's meeting with Princess Selene were filled with uncertainty. Tensions between the people of Aurora and the Zyrexians continued to rise. Every day, Selene and her advisors worked tirelessly to find a peaceful solution. But each new report seemed to make the situation worse. Jackson stayed by her side, offering his support, his advice, and his presence. Despite the growing threat, he found himself growing closer to her, not just as an ally, but as something more. One evening, as the sun set behind the towering spires of Aurora's palace, Selene called for another meeting. Jackson entered the room to find her staring at a large map spread across the table, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. The light from the setting sun cast a golden glow on her face, making her look even more regal. There was a quiet sadness in her eyes, one that Jackson couldn't ignore. "Jackson, I need your help," Selene said without looking up. Her voice was firm, but there was a vulnerability in it that made Jackson's heart ache. "I've made my decision. Can't wait any longer. We have to strike first." Jackson took a step closer, his eyes narrowing in concern. "You're not serious, are you?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. "I've tried everything to avoid this, but the Zyrexians won't listen. They've attacked our borders, and if we don't act now, they will destroy everything we've built." She paused, her expression softening. "I'm not sure I can do this, Jackson. I'm not sure I can send my people to war." Jackson could see the weight of her words and the way her shoulders slumped. She wasn't just a princess making a political decision. She was a woman torn between her duty and her conscience. He had never imagined her to be so conflicted, But now that he saw it, he understood the true burden of her position. War is never easy, Jackson said softly. I've seen what it can do to a people. But I've also seen what happens when you don't act. You lose everything. Celine nodded, her eyes darkened with the weight of her responsibility. I know that. But it's not just my people I'm worried about. It's you, Jackson. I'm dragging you into something that could change everything. Jackson stepped forward, placing a hand on the table next to hers. You didn't drag me into anything. I chose to be here. I chose to stand by your side. His voice was firm, yet filled with an emotion he hadn't expected to feel. I'm with you, Celine. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his for any sign of doubt. What she found instead was the same unwavering resolve that he had always shown. For a moment, she simply stared at him, as though seeing him in a new light. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then, with a deep breath, she straightened her posture. I'll need you to help me prepare our forces. Can't hesitate any longer. Jackson nodded. Do whatever I can. But you're not alone in this. I'll make sure your people are ready. Celine smiled faintly, but the sadness never quite left her eyes. I hope you understand the gravity of what you're agreeing to, Jackson. If we go to war, there will be no turning back. Jackson met her gaze, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He knew what she meant. Once the first blow was struck, there would be no peace until the war was won. But in that moment, he made a promise to himself and to her that he would stand by her no matter the cost. I understand, he said, his voice steady, and I'll be there with you every step of the way. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. Celine's people, the people of Aurora, would soon march to war. Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of dread in his chest, but there was something else there too, a sense of pride. He had never felt more connected to her, and he knew that, together, they would face whatever came their way. The plan in the days that followed, Jackson and Celine worked together to prepare for the coming conflict. They went over strategies, mapped out battle plans, and secured alliances with other species who had long respected the strength of Aurora. The Zyrexians had underestimated the resolve of Aurora's people, and now they would see the full force of their might. Jackson spent most of his time with Celine, offering his military expertise and guiding her through the process of organizing her forces. There was an intensity in their work and urgency that grew with each passing hour. But through it all, Jackson never lost sight of her. He watched her lead with strength, with grace, and with a quiet sadness that he could never truly understand. The eve of battle, as the two of them stood on the balcony overlooking the city, Jackson could sense the weight of the moment. The air was thick with anticipation. The stars above seemed to shine brighter than ever. Tomorrow will be the start of something new, Celine said quietly, her voice distant. For better or for worse, we will shape the future of our people. Jackson turned to her, his gaze soft but resolute. And we'll do it together, Celine. Make sure the future is worth fighting for. Celine looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. I don't know what will happen, but I'm glad you're here. Jackson smiled, the weight of his promise heavy on his shoulders. We're in this together, Princess. No matter what happens, I'll be by your side. They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the future pressing down on them both. The war was coming, and there was no avoiding it. But for the first time in a long while, Jackson felt a sense of hope. Together, they would face whatever challenges came next. And together, they would fight for the future. The day of battle arrived faster than Jackson had expected. The tension in the air was thick with anticipation. He could feel it in every corner of the palace, every hallway he walked through. The soldiers of Aurora were ready. The Zyrexians were coming. And Jackson, though not a soldier by profession, felt the weight of it all on his shoulders. The night before, Celine had asked him to meet her in the war room. She was going over the final details of their plan, preparing for what could be the most important day of her life. She stood at the large table, surrounded by maps and documents. Her face was hard to read, but there was a quiet resolve in her eyes. She knew the risk, and yet she moved forward without hesitation. Jackson. Selena's voice was calm but serious. I need to tell you something. She paused, looking down at the map in front of her. Tomorrow may change everything. We are going to strike first, but we cannot afford to lose. If we do, Aurora will fall, and I will have failed my people. Jackson stepped closer, his gaze never leaving her. You won't fail, Celine. She met his eyes then, her expression softening just a little. I hope you're right, but this isn't just about me. It's about my people, my family, my legacy. She paused again, taking a deep breath. And it's about you too. You've chosen to stand by my side, and for that, I'll be forever grateful. Jackson didn't know what to say. He had never been good with words, especially when emotions ran high. But he did know one thing: he would fight by her side, no matter the cost. There was no turning back now. The decision had been made, and both of them were committed to seeing it through. We'll win this, Celine, Jackson said, his voice firm. Together, she gave him a small smile. It was barely a smile, but it was enough to make his heart beat a little faster. Together, she echoed. The next morning, the soldiers of Aurora gathered on the battlefields outside the palace. Jackson had never seen anything like it. The warriors, dressed in shining armor, stood in perfect formation, their eyes set with determination. They were ready. Celine, standing at the front, was their leader. Jackson couldn't help but admire her strength. She had trained her entire life for this moment, and she didn't falter now. She stood tall, as if she were born for this. We fight for our home. We fight for our future. Selena's voice rang out over the soldiers. She held a sword in her hand, a symbol of her authority. Today, we make our stand. For Aurora, for peace. The soldiers cheered in unison, their voices echoing across the plains. Jackson stood off to the side, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't a soldier, but he felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a battle. This was a fight for everything Celine had worked for. This was a fight for their future. As the battle began, Jackson found himself in the midst of the chaos. The Zyrexians were ruthless, their ships soaring through the sky, firing lasers at everything in their path. Aurora's forces responded with equal force, but Jackson couldn't help but notice the difference. The Zyrexians fought with cold precision, while the people of Aurora fought with heart and soul. There was a fire in their eyes, fire that told Jackson they would not back down. Through the smoke and fire, Jackson kept his focus on Celine. She was everywhere, leading her people with unmatched courage. She was fierce and unyielding, her movements fluid and powerful. Jackson had never seen anyone like her before. She wasn't just a leader, she was a symbol of hope, a symbol of everything they were fighting for. But as the hours passed, Jackson saw the toll the battle was taking. On Celine, she didn't stop. She didn't even flinch. But he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her steps began to slow. The burden she carried was not just the weight of the battle, but the weight of the decisions she had made. Every strike, every command, was one more step toward the future she hoped to create. But Jackson knew the cost. As the battle raged on, a sudden explosion shook the ground beneath their feet. A nearby ship had been hit, and debris flew through the air. Jackson turned to see Celine standing, staring at the wreckage, her expression unreadable. "Celine, we need to fall back," Jackson shouted, rushing to her side. But she didn't move. She just stood there, watching as the chaos unfolded around her. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We can't fall back. Not now. Not after everything we've done." Jackson could see the pain in her eyes. She didn't want to give up, not after everything they had fought for. But he could see it in her stance. She was tired. And so was everyone else. The battle had taken its toll, and Celine knew it. But she wasn't willing to back down. Not yet. "Please, Celine," Jackson said, his voice softening. "You've done enough. We can't lose you." For a moment she looked at him, her gaze piercing. And then, as if a weight had lifted from her shoulders, she nodded. "Okay, fall back." Jackson didn't hesitate. He turned to the soldiers, shouting orders to retreat. The battle wasn't over, but they had to regroup. They couldn't win without Celine. They couldn't win without hope. As they fell back to the safety of the palace, Jackson stayed close to Celine. He could see the strain in her face, the burden of her decisions. But there was something else there too, something stronger. Determination. She had made a choice, and she would see it through. "We'll win this," Jackson said quietly, his voice steady. "You'll see." Celine turned to him, her expression softening. "Thank you, Jackson." And in that moment, Jackson knew they would make it through. The battle wasn't over, but they had won something important. They had won a chance. That Jackson knew was all they needed. The battle had been raging for hours, and the streets of Aurora were filled with the sounds of chaos. Jackson stood beside Princess Celine, his heart pounding in his chest. The war they had fought so hard to avoid was now upon them, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The Zyrexians were relentless, and though Aurora's soldiers fought with all their might, Jackson knew the outcome wasn't certain. "We can't let them break through," Celine said, her voice tight with urgency as she surveyed the battlefield. Her eyes scanned the horizon where the last of the Zyrexian ships hovered. "We've come too far for this to end in defeat." Jackson nodded, his gaze following hers. The air was thick with smoke, and the stench of burning debris filled his nostrils. The once beautiful city of Aurora was now scarred by the conflict, its buildings reduced to rubble. Yet despite the destruction, the people of Aurora refused to give up. "We'll hold them off," Jackson said, his voice calm, though his heart was racing. "We've fought this far. We're not going to lose now." Celine turned to him, her eyes fierce with determination. "No, we won't, not while I'm still standing." Jackson couldn't help but admire her resolve. She had led her people through the darkest hours, and even now, when everything seemed lost, she refused to back down. He knew she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone in Aurora, for her people, her family, and the future they all hoped to build. "Let's do this," Jackson said, taking a step forward. Celine gave a small nod, her hand tightening around the hilt of her sword. With a sharp breath, she turned to her soldiers, rallying them with words of encouragement. They responded with a loud cheer, and the energy in the air shifted. It was as if the weight of the battle had finally given way to a sense of purpose. They had one last chance to win, and they were going to take it. The Zyrexians pushed forward, their forces overwhelming, but the people of Aurora stood firm. Jackson found himself fighting beside them, using all his strength and training to protect the city. Though he wasn't a soldier by trade, the battle had become personal for him. It wasn't just about saving Aurora anymore, it was about protecting Celine, the woman who had captured his heart. "We won't stop until the last one falls." Celine's voice rang out as she led the charge, her presence like a beacon of hope for her soldiers. Jackson could see it in their eyes, the same fire that had burned in him since the first day he had met her. They believed in her, and now they believed in victory. But as the battle raged on, Jackson couldn't ignore the feeling of fear that gripped him. He had seen too many lives lost, too much destruction. Is there any way to truly win this war without sacrificing everything? As much as he tried to push the thought away, it lingered in the back of his mind. "Celine," Jackson shouted as he moved through the battlefield to her side. She was cutting down enemies with swift precision, but Jackson could see the toll the fight was taking on her. She was tired, her movements slower than they had been earlier. Her armor was scratched and dented from the battle, and her face was smeared with dirt and blood. "We need to regroup," Jackson shouted, grabbing her arm. "You're pushing yourself too hard. We can't win if we lose you." Celine shook her head, her eyes flashing with defiance. "We're not losing. Not today." Her voice was full of determination, but Jackson could see the exhaustion in her gaze. Jackson stepped in front of her, blocking her path as she tried to push forward again. "You're not invincible, Celine. You need to rest." For a moment, Celine didn't respond. She simply stared at him, her chest rising and falling with each breath. Then slowly, she lowered her sword and nodded. "All right. But we can't." "Stop now." They retreated to a safer position, where Celine could catch her breath. Jackson remained by her side, watching the battle unfold around them. The Zyrexians were relentless, but the people of Aurora were growing stronger with every passing moment. They had their backs against the wall, but they refused to give up. And with Celine leading them, Jackson couldn't help but believe they had a chance. Hours later, the battle reached its climax. The forces of Aurora had pushed the Zyrexians back, their final assault breaking through the enemy lines. Selene stood at the front of her soldiers, her sword raised high as they made their final charge. The air was thick with smoke, but the light of the sun breaking through the clouds seemed to shine down on them like a sign. This was their moment. With a final push, the last of the Zyrexians were defeated. The battlefield fell silent. The only sound the labored breathing of the soldiers who had fought so hard. Jackson stood beside Selene, both of them looking out over the war-torn city. It was over. The Zyrexians had been defeated, but the cost had been high. The city was in ruins, and many had given their lives for the victory. "We did it, Jackson," he said, his voice quiet. Selene nodded, her eyes searching the horizon. "We did, but at what cost?" Her voice was filled with sorrow, and Jackson could hear the weight of her words. The victory they had fought for was bittersweet. Aurora was free, but it would take time to heal. "We'll rebuild," Jackson said firmly. "We'll rebuild together." Selene turned to him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Together, they stood there for a long time, taking in the destruction that surrounded them. But even in the midst of the devastation, there was a sense of hope. The people of Aurora had survived. They had fought for their future, and they had won, as the sun set over the battlefield. Jackson knew that this was just the beginning. The war was over, but their journey was far from done. They had a future to build, and no matter what it took, he would stand by Selena's side. They had faced the darkness together, and now they would face the future together.